Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our countdown of the 100 greatest books ever written, as we slowly encroach on the top 20. And we're starting off today's batch of 10 with an oddity, a book whose presence on this list would have mystified and amazed its author, and that is The Natural History of Selborne by Gilbert White. A weird, unclassifiable oddity of a type that we have very few of on this list, a book that isn't really a book, a treatise that isn't really a treatise. This is a humble country person walking around his neighborhood centuries ago and recording the wildlife. What the weather's like, what the trees are like, what the sunlight is like, what the animals are doing, and what season they're doing it in. It's all written without any literary pretense. It's all written without any eye on eternity, and yet, it casts a spell. It is one of the most reprinted books in the English language. It's one of the most popular books in the English language. It might not be known to you, but the minute that you give it a fair try, it will extend its spell to you. It always does, to anybody. I don't quite know what the reason for that is, and I've read this thing a million times. I still don't know what the source of its magic is, other than maybe the complete escape of it all. It's so small. It's so cozy. It's so earnest in caring about its little details. There's something very relieving about that. But nevertheless, even though it wasn't really considered by its author to be a book, here it is on this list. Then we move to a great big boisterous novel. This is Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, that has the benefit but also defect of having a standout character. One of the women in this book is a standout character that eclipses the rest of the story. There's nothing completely wrong with that. The only reason that I raise an eyebrow is because often when you see that, you get the distinct accompanying impression that it's not part of the author's control. And I don't like to reward things that the author isn't trying to do, that the author isn't aware of or able to control. I don't think that Thackeray had much control over Becky Sharp, but maybe not. Maybe he did. But the point that I want to make is that there's a lot more to this book than just that one character. This is actually a sprawling and very moving personal drama. Aside from that one character, all the other characters are heartfelt, even though a couple of them are cardboard. And it has a sweeping emotional effect that will send you back over and over again to Vanity Fair. Then we can deal with, we'll go to the ancient world to deal with something that is often called a proto-novel. I would probably agree with that. This is Apuleius. This is his book, The Golden Ass. This is a cover that I just pulled off the internet, but you will almost certainly find this translated by Robert Graves, the author of I, Claudius and Claudius the God. Nothing wrong with that. Graves was an antic, energetic, able translator. The only thing you have to worry about is that he was also nuts. And that will affect his translation of this or anything else. Like, for instance, if you want to read Suetonius' Life of the 12 Caesars, overwhelmingly the chances are that you're going to hit Robert Graves' translation. Nothing wrong with that, like I said, but in this, as in all cases, whether you know the translator's name or not, I strongly suggest trying as many translations as you can find until you find one that works, instead of just thinking, oh, well, I'd better go with it. I guess I don't have a choice. You do. You do have a choice. But this is a strange novel of transformations. It is funny. Another slight problem that I have with the ubiquitous Robert Graves translation is that he himself was completely humorless. Not only in effect, but also in perception. I'm sure that those aspects of this book went right by him. So the attempts here, they aren't good. If you aren't laughing at this book, in addition to wincing and caring, then you're in the hands of a wrong translator. So bear that in mind with any ancient work. Then we move on to something that does have a standard translation, and the standard translation of this work is rather wonderful. So you don't really have to worry about it. It's almost certainly going to be the one you encounter. This, the greatest books of all time. How he would have loved to know that he was on this list. The complete opposite of Gilbert White. This is the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, who made that beautiful thing on the cover here of the Penguin Classic, and who has made a whole bunch of other things, some of which you will be visually familiar with. This is the story of his life as an artist. And the reason I'm smiling is twofold. One, it's completely spellbinding. Just completely spellbinding in exactly the same way, I would argue, as the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon. And the other reason why I'm smiling is the reason why it's spellbinding, and that also is identical to the Pillar Book of Say Shonagon, which is that you believe, you get the sense right away when you're reading this book that you are in the presence of a master BSer. You have no idea how many of these stories are true. You can guess that a huge number of them are not. That Benvenuto Cellini loves to tell tall tales in which he is not only Paul Bunyan, but Paul Bunyan's ox. And it's done so wonderfully that you don't mind. I think he would have been infuriated and probably violent, since it didn't take much to produce violence in this man, if you had told him that of all his works, this thing on paper would be his greatest. I think that would have infuriated him, as opposed to sculpture or ornament or whatever. But nevertheless, it's true. And this is delightful. Just find a standard English translation. Then we'll go back to the ancient world. This is going to raise, the further back in time we go, the more questions are going to be raised about translations. And here it's really tricky because a lot of it is pointed satirical humor. I've mentioned many times before that humor is the first casualty of translation. And over millennia, even worse. So you really should shop around until you find a translation of this particular work, this particular author, that gives you some sense of why this would be so beloved, why people would have been singing these ditties, humming these tunes, talking about these things back when they were the work of the moment, when they were brand new. These are the satires of Juvenal. And they are wonderful. They give us the ancient Roman world better than almost any other work. It's just a question of the translator. That's all. I'm pulling these pictures off the internet merely to show you the book. In most cases, unless I say otherwise, I am not using them as an exemplar of the version of the book that you should get. In this case, this is is this Lionel Roach? No, Hubert Creekmore. I would argue the scholarship on this is really good, but I would argue against the translation. But it might work for you. In this case, as in all cases, when we're talking about this sort of thing, check out as many as you can. But Juvenal is an irrepressible and completely unique voice, so it's worth it to hunt around for a translation, some translation that will let you into his world. Same thing with this next one. There's a lot of translated stuff this time around. This is not only an ancient work, and it's not only a translated work for most of you, but it's also a translation from another world. Translating from the Latin when you are in a Latin language, when you're in a Latinate language, a Romance language, is not going from one plane of reality to another. Translating from the Spanish or the Italian is not the same thing as this. This is the poems of Wang Wei. And these are delightful. They are crystalline cut gems of beauty. And unlike Juvenal, and unlike a couple of other authors that I've mentioned before and will mention afterwards, a great many very sensitive poets in English have turned their hand to rendering this author's work. So these pen portraits of evanescent moments of nature, very similar in many ways, and maybe that was on my mind, very similar in many ways to A Natural History of Selborne. There have been many very sensitive wordsmiths who have rendered this poet's work over the years. I forget who does, this is the Penguin Classic from eons ago. They might have a newer Penguin Classic. I don't remember exactly who does the translation here, but I felt the magic, and that's what you want to go for, especially if it's a translated work, the original of which you cannot read. So you have no sense whatsoever at all. You're totally in the translator's hands. If the introduction to the work, the edition that you're reading, says that the work is magical, if all of the secondary sources that you read about it, reflecting on it, call it magical, and you read a translation that is not magical, you are reading a bad translation. That's all there is to it. That's what you want to look for here. But in this case, it will be, believe it or not, easier to find, despite the legions of classicists who have gone at Juvenal or Horace or Menander or whatever. It's not much. It's not much in the way of poetry. It's not a big volume. Well worth your time. Then we go. These are all Penguin Classic covers that I'm giving you, just because I've taught a lot of these works from Penguin Classics, and I was always cheering on Penguin Classics for putting these things in bookstores everywhere in the West, for putting them in train stations, and classrooms. I love the dissemination factor. Not necessarily championing every translation. This is Froissart. This is his chronicles of, these are his chronicles, which are histories of the 14th century. They bring his time period, they bring the 14th century to life amazingly, full of dialogue. He isn't putting it as what we would consider dialogue, but you could easily render that way. And a new translation, if there ever were to be one of this work for a popular audience, would definitely do that, or should. Lots of, I want to say, psychology as well. That also is buried under 14th century terms, but nevertheless, this was meant to be entertaining. This author's best friend and patroness very much thought that a boring book is a bad book. And so this is meant to be entertaining, and after all this time, after all these centuries, it still does entertain, and has shrewd insights into humans. And then this next one here, of course, we can't do a top 100 greatest books of all time without, of course, including the greatest Irish classic of the 20th century. What list would be complete without this book, right? I mean, yes, it's big and it's long and it's intricate and it can be daunting, and I realize that can be intimidating for some readers, but I'm afraid there's no way not to have this big Irish classic on the list. I'm, of course, referring to The Dirty Dust by Martin O'Caden. What other giant Irish classic of the 20th century could you have had in mind? Maybe a heap of pile of garbage? I don't know. Why would you even think about a heaping pile of garbage for a best 100 books of all time list? I don't know. Maybe you've been trained to do that. This is you can render the title in a few different ways. There are now, thankfully, a handful of good translations of this work, and as you can tell from the cover, this is all about dead people. So this is, in the main, conversations held between dead people in a graveyard. Chattering clay, dirty dust, whatever you want to call it. There are intervals with living people, and the bickering and the bile and the human insight, the very black humor, it's all just wonderful. Just perfectly rendered, perfectly done. And always, of course, as any great Irish classic will do, wanting to invite the reader in, tell them a story that will upset them, enlighten them, make them smile, entertain them, rather than intentionally baffle them with page after page after page after page after page of masturbatory obscurity. Who would write an Irish epic of the 20th century that would be like that? I can't imagine that such a book would be venerated. This, of course, doesn't do that. No worthwhile book will do that. So, an Irish classic well worth your time. And then we'll move on to an English classic, one of the greatest novels ever written in the English language. This is Middlemarch by George Eliot. Her story of a little provincial town and the little provincial lives that happen there, and the unfolding drama in a handful of those lives that intersect and reinforce each other and undercut each other. And that description, the only description that you give of Middlemarch, is not like Wellington attacks or Napoleon defends himself in the middle of this book. There's no echoes of Waterloo like in Vanity Fair. That description is complete. You would think from that description that this is the most boring book in the world, and instead it is a marvel, an absolute marvel. And then we can finish up with a last name, a surname that none of you were wondering about. This is Emily Bronte's novel Wuthering Heights, which is weird and uneven and even fragmentary and definitely amateurish in a number of different ways, in a number of different plot ways, character development ways, amateurish. No other word. So you would think with all of that there's no chance that it would be on this list. Something that would have those adjectives accurately deployed. There's no way it would be on this list. But this has a power. This book has a power barely contained in the page, barely containable by the author. It's the power of the sheer whirling wildness of what she wants to write that I think unseats an otherwise sound ability to control her narrative. So although you will right away know its deficiencies, you'll right away see them. It always confuses students encountering this book for the first time, is that they read it, they start to see deficiencies. At first they think, am I imagining things? Then they realize, no, wait, I'm not imagining things. That was just ineptly done. And that over the years, some of them come to me and said, isn't that just ineptly done? And I say, yes, it is. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It not ultimately matters in this book. So there you go. Wuthering Heights, of course, is on this list, and we will move on next time to our penultimate Decalogue. I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.